Hello everybody and welcome to this EduSat session. Let me begin by introducing myself. I am Neera Singh from the Faculty of English here at IGNOU, and I am coordinating the second year MA English elective course on New Literatures in English, MEG 8. Now basically in this session what I am going to do is to take you through the 8 blocks of this course and give you a sort of bird's eye view of what we've taught you in these 8 blocks. Right? So let's begin with MEG 8, New Literatures in English. Now basically the aim of this course is to familiarize you students with the various new literatures that have come up in our curriculum during the past couple of decades. You know, till now, basically the literature that we were all reading belonged either to the United Kingdoms, Britain for example, or for that matter the US of A, United States. But in recent couple of decades, there has been a great interest in literatures emanating from other countries other than those of Britain and the United States. Right. So we are going to have a look at what these new countries are and what is the kind of literature that has come out from these countries. So basically we are going to familiarize you through a study of the representative texts. We are also going to show you how rich this body of literature is. We will also take you through the similarities and differences of these literatures, and we are also going to show you how historical, social, political and cultural pressures sort of impinge upon these literatures, and how the ethnic contexts of the various countries from which these literatures are coming, how these ethnic contexts influence them. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the 8 blocks, but before that let me just give you an overall picture of the 8 blocks and the text that we have taught you. Now the first block is the introduction, in which we've basically tried to fix the nomenclature of the term New Literatures in English. Then block 2 and 3 we have devoted to African literature, in which we have taken up Wole Soyinka's A Dance of the Forests. Then block 4 we have taught you South Asian literature with Bapsi Sidhwa's Ice Candy Man forming the main representative text. Then in block 5 we have Caribbean literature, and the author we have taken up is V.S. Naipaul, and the text that we have taken up is A House for Mr. Biswas. In block 6 and block 6 also is devoted to Caribbean literature, with Derek Walcott and Edward Braithwaite being the 2 poets that we have taken up. Block 7 is on Australian literature, and we have taken up Patrick White's The Solid Mandala, a novel by him. And last is block 8, which we have devoted to Canadian literature, and the
प्रोसेस अभी वहाँ का उसके कंप्यूटर डिवीजन के थ्रू है ना.
हाँ, वंडरफुल.
यूपीएस की एमसी कंप्यूटर डिवीजन.
Now in block 7, we have taken up Australian literature. The author that we have taken up is Patrick White, and the text that we have taken up is The Solid Mandala. And lastly, block 8, we have done Canadian literature, Margaret Laurence being the author that we have taken up, and A Stone Angel, a very popular novel by her, is the representative text that we have chosen. Alright, so this was basically a bird's eye view of what we've taught you in the 8 blocks. Now, let's go through each of the blocks, a quick gloss over. Right. Now, in block 1, which forms the introduction of this course, we have tried to fix the nomenclature of the term new literatures in English. Why is it that we call it new literatures? Because basically, down the ages, it has variously been known as Commonwealth literature, it has been known as colonial literature, it has been known as post-colonial literature. And so let's trace the development of this change of the name. You know, what happens is that there is always a time lag in human history between, I would say, the emergence of a phenomenon and its correct designation in human terms. You know, there is a time lapse between the time a thing comes up and before we sort of give a proper name to it. And the same is true of new literatures in English, because firstly it was called Commonwealth literatures because it came out from countries that belonged under the umbrella of the Commonwealth. But slowly down the ages, this term became unacceptable to various nationalists who wanted to de-emphasize the colonial past. You know, it started carrying too much mental baggage along with it, so this term became redundant. After that, it started being called colonial literatures. That too had difficulties because the name seemed to suggest a preoccupation with only that point of time when the colonial powers were ruling over the various countries. So then we started calling it post-colonial literatures. Technically, that meant the whole process from the time the powers came into the country till the time the nations got their independence. But because of the semantic basis of the term, you know, post-colonial, which means after colonization, this also started having problems because it sort of suggested the time period after the imperial power had left. Alright, so eventually then we started calling it new literatures in English. Now, when we call it new literatures, there is a double sort of a meaning of the term new. You know, new means all those countries which had newly gained their independence, like India, like the various countries of Africa, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Kenya, and so on and so forth. It also meant the settler colonies like Australia and Canada, where, you know, new people had gone and settled. Okay, so that was one connotation of the word new. And secondly, this literature was new because the nations in which it sort of came up already had a body of literature present in their regional languages, in the native tongues. So this body of literature which came up in English was comparatively a newer phenomena for those nations. Alright, so new literatures seemed to have no political connotations and it had a more, I would say, a more generous sort of a connotation, and it became acceptable to all the nationalists as well as all the others. So no quarrel with the term new literatures. Alright. Now, whatever the name we give the literature, it has to be acknowledged that it is a vast body of literature which is not only a supplement to British literature or literature from USA, but it complements it in a very generous kind of a way. You know, there is this whole body, there's a whole common wealth of knowledge waiting to be explored. Okay. And of course we cannot ignore this literature because 3/4 of the world has had its history, you know, sort of affected by the colonial process. So it is a very important part of all our histories, and therefore it is essential that we read it, right? Now, after that, we have gone on to describe the similarities and the basic differences of these literatures. You know, thematically, there are a lot of similarities because at the very base, there is a shared colonial experience. All right. So there is a impulse to share in post-colonial reorganization and post-colonial reconstruction. So that is one of the basic similarities of this literature. Another similarity is the use of the English language. Of course, English as it was in Britain is quite different from what it is in these new literatures. And often we talk of English at the center meaning British, as capital E English, and English from these various other countries as small lowercase English, because a lot of nuances of the native tongue sort of seeped into this language. So anyway, there was similarity in themes and there was similarity in language. But of course, there were a lot of differences also, because, you know, there were two types of colonization. There were the settler colonies and there were the invader colonies. The settler colonies were Australia and Canada, where the British powers, European powers went and settled there. And there were the invader colonies where, like Africa and India, where the imperial powers came primarily with the purpose of trade and commerce, and then they sort of invaded us and stayed on till independence. Okay, so of course there will be different in themes, because as far as the settler colonies are concerned, you know, the themes there would be sort of a quest for identity, a quest for self-definition, whereas the themes in the invader colonies would be dispossession, cultural fragmentation, because the people who were already natives living here, we were sort of you know, we were fragmented souls. We became dispossessed from our own land. Okay, so the themes that seeped into literature were different in that sense of the term, right? So this is what basically we've spoken about in block 1. Now when we go on to block 2, we have taken up A Grain of Wheat by Ngugi wa Thiong'o as the representative text, and you know, this is one of the most interesting novels that has come out of Africa. And I would like to mention here that reading of literature is always more interesting and thought-provoking when one has a knowledge of the society, when one has a knowledge of the history, the culture, the major events, and the period of the nation at the back of one's mind. So if we are at all familiar with African literature and African history, we know that Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a very famous writer from Kenya, and he has a lot of influence and he's had a lot of interest in the national politics. And basically, he wrote this novel at the time of Kenyan independence, and the Kenyan War of Independence forms the framework within which he has written this novel. Now, the Kenyan War of Independence, in its most violent phase, was called the Mau Mau movement. Okay, what had happened was that you know, the Africans had really been downtrodden by the British. Their most fertile lands had been taken over by the British, and the British were making them work on these lands for a very small pittance. You know, at that point of time, India had also very recently gained its independence. So that also motivated the Africans to sort of raise their voice for their own independence. So these were some of the factors which led to the Kenyan independence, and this is what Ngugi wa Thiong'o has taken as the backdrop of his novel. Okay. Now, we have given you a very detailed background to Africa, to the various European powers that had come in Africa, and through this novel and through the protagonist of this novel called Mugo, Ngugi wa Thiong'o has presented a very vivid picture of this volatile period of African history. And through this protagonist, Mugo, who is a veteran in a detention camp, he sort of symbolizes every man who has to take a decision as to what he stands for. Because, you know, Mugo also betrays the national cause for his own individual benefit. And so at a symbolic level, this novel is a sort of it represents every man who at some point of the time, or the other, has to take a decision as to what he stands for, and to what extent he can sort of withstand pressures, right? Then we go on to the second block, that's block 3, second African block, which is the Dance of the Forests by Wole Soyinka. Now, of course, Wole Soyinka is a world famous figure. He's a Nobel Prize winner, belongs to Nigeria. He's a political activist, and even when he was getting his Nobel Prize, during the speech, acceptance speech, he had launched into a very scathing attack on European powers and how the Europeans had misinterpreted and what sort of racism that they had been involved in. Okay, and he sincerely believes, Wole Soyinka believes, that a writer should not live in an ivory tower. He should come down to the grassroots levels, and he can and he must have a sort of a role, an active role in the society and in the political activities of his nation. Okay, so this play that we have taken up, A Dance of the Forest, is a slightly complex kind of a play, because you know, the location of the play as well as the language of the play is slightly unfamiliar to us as Indians. Then it's steeped in Yoruba myth. Yoruba is you know, one of the ethnic groups prevalent in Africa, and in fact Wole Soyinka belongs to this ethnic group, Yoruba. So there is a lot of Yoruba myth also present in this play. Also, the language is slightly difficult to unravel, because part of it is in pidginized English to sort of capture the ethnic, the rural life of Nigeria, and at other times there's a lot of I would say sophisticated rhetoric in the play, also in the language, to sort of present the complexities of African life. So there are a lot of difficulties in this play, but we've sort of given you a very comprehensive picture of Africa, of the language, of the culture, of this ethnic group called Yoruba. And so after we've explained all these in details, the play is not very difficult to understand. All right. So it's basically at the end of the block you'll discover that it's quite simple to understand. Then we go on to block 4, which is Bapsi Sidhwa's Ice Candy Man. Now, this is the South Asian component of our course, and the novel that we have taken to represent the South Asian component is Ice Candy Man by Bapsi Sidhwa. And this novel is set in the extremely volatile period of the partition of India and Pakistan, which is 1947. Now, basically the South Indian component, the countries that come under this rubric are India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal. And why we've chosen a Pakistani novelist is because in our second year electives, we also have another course on Indian writing in English, and therefore you get a lot of authors there for the Indian writing in English, and therefore we felt that we must take a slightly different author, and we've chosen Bapsi Sidhwa. Alright, and because most of these countries were gaining their independence during this period, you know, the 1940s, 1950s, there is a lot of commonality of themes in the literature that is coming out from there. For example, the East-West encounter is one of the major themes which is prevalent in this literature. Then partition is, of course, a very, very major theme. It's a very large issue that a lot of writers like Khushwant Singh and Manohar Malgonkar have taken up. All right. Now, in this block also, like I keep saying, you know, no author writes in a vacuum. The political, social, cultural, historical pressures around always impinge on a writer's consciousness. So, we have given you a brief overview of, in fact not a brief overview, we've given you a rather detailed background of the Parsi community to which Bapsi Sidhwa belongs, because unless we get to know the Parsi ethos, we cannot sort of explain why Bapsi Sidhwa wrote like that. Alright, so we've told you that, you know, we've given you the historical perspective on this minority community which forms a part of our country, and that gives you a better grasp of the novel. Secondly, we've given you, we've presented this novel Ice Candy Man as an autobiographical novel, because the child protagonist, the 9-year-old Lenny, is also infected with polio, and Bapsi Sidhwa herself had polio when she was a little child. Okay. Then what we've also spoken about is the woman as victim paradigm, because you know the riots that we have shown, that Bapsi Sidhwa has shown in these novels are seen as being orchestrated by males, right? Then this novel also symbolizes the politicians. But you know, at one level it is a political kind of a novel, but it has very subtle political undertones. Nothing is stated overtly. It's done very subtly. You know, for example, the Ice Candy Man is compared to the politicians of that time, you know, who wore various garbs, took on various roles to fool the people. Similarly, the Ice Candy Man sometimes takes on the garb of a holy man, sometimes he becomes a bird seller, sometimes he becomes an ice cream seller. So, you know, he symbolizes the politicians of that age, and of course even now, that of course very subtly brings out the message that somewhere Bapsi Sidhwa is actually satirizing the political connotations of this novel, right? Okay, what is interesting in this novel is that a Pakistani view of the partition has been projected, not an Indian view, which is what most of the Indian writers that we are going to read in the next course normally do. Alright. Then we go on to block 5, which is the Caribbean component along with block 6 of our course, and the text that we have taken up is V.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas. Now, I am again repeating this at the risk of sounding monotonous, that literary productions are always entangled with historical moments as well as social conditions as well as cultural conditions. Therefore, any study that comes out of the Caribbean has to acknowledge and it has to contend with some of the basic sense of its diasporic nature. Now, what is diaspora? Diaspora literally means dispersion, and it comes from the Bible, in which we described the scattering of the Jews in various parts of parts outside Palestine, right? But today, diaspora stands for those groups of people who have gone from their mother country and settled in large numbers in various other countries. For example, Indians who've settled in another country are known as the Indian diaspora. Pakistanis who've settled elsewhere are called the Pakistani diaspora. And so because Caribbean, the population in the Caribbean islands largely consists of various people from various parts of the world, and they've sort of settled there and become one homogenized whole. That is why we have to sort of keep this background in mind of the diasporic nature of the society. Secondly, what we also have to keep in mind is the indentured system. Now, after the abolition of slavery, you know, the indentured system came into being, in which workers were taken from various parts of the world to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean islands, and there they were made to work after having gone into a written agreement with their masters. So in that one sense it was a sort of slavery, not exactly, it was better than slavery, but it was a written agreement between the masters and these indentured laborers who hardly had any rights of their own. Alright, so this is the backdrop against which we have to study A House for Mr. Biswas. Now, this novel shows the life of immigrants from India in Trinidad. And the whole novel is very interesting because, Mr. Biswas, who is the protagonist of the novel, spends his whole life trying to make a house for himself. And of course, at the symbolic level, at one level, it's about individual struggle, about the struggle of Mr. Biswas, who is trying to make a house for himself. But the struggle also stands for the colonial man's physical and psychic disposition. You know, the people who were colonized actually became fragmented personalities, and they constantly spent their time and their lives trying to find an identity for themselves, trying to belong, trying to find a sort of individual life for themselves. And so this novel and the quest for a house by Mr. Biswas stands for colonial man's struggle and his quest for identity. Okay. Now we go on to block 6, which is poetry by Derek Walcott and Edward Brathwaite. Again, this is a Caribbean block, and just as I've mentioned, Caribbean society emerged out of successive waves of free and forced migration from various countries. Now the culture of all the people mixed amongst each other, and to a certain extent it homogenized together and it became one complete whole. But at the same time, these people also retained their own individual identity and their own individual cultures. Okay, so it became not really a homogenized whole, but it was a heterogeneous society. So people belonged to two cultures. One was the new culture into which they sort of went like a melting pot, but they also retained their own indigenous culture. Okay, now Derek Walcott and Edward Brathwaite are both of them concerned with this multicultural Caribbean aesthetics, I would say. Alright, but there are two opposing stands on it. Walcott stresses upon this multicultural diversity, and Brathwaite takes another view on it, and he only talks about the African roots of the Caribbean culture. Alright, but basically what they're talking about is the colonization of this country, and first of all their poetry endorses the process of colonization, then it reflects this process of colonization, and eventually towards the end it subverts this whole process of colonization, which is what really happened in all the other rest of the countries. There was firstly endorsing, then there was reflection, and then there was subversion. Alright, so these were the two Caribbean blocks. Then we come to block 7, which is Patrick White's novel, The Solid Mandala. Now it's very interesting, the study of Australian literature, or for that matter the study of Canadian literature, because a question often arises as to why we should study, how is it important for us as Indians to study Australian or Canadian literature. Now, to answer both of these questions simultaneously, first of all, Australian literature is part of world literatures, right? Then it also is integral to the development of socio-political, historical and a cultural awareness of Australia. Also, it's useful to explore the connections between Australia and India's past. There are similarities between both the countries because of the process of colonization. And lastly, it also leads to an interaction in areas of culture and economy between India and Australia. And the same thing can be repeated for Canadian literature. Why do we read that? Because it is part of world literatures. It leads to development in socio-political, historical and cultural awareness between Canada and India. It explores the connections between India and Canada's past, and it leads to an interaction between the two countries. Okay, now to take block 7 first, let me just very briefly give you a history of Australia. You know, even before the invasion by Captain Cook, there were indigenous people who were living in Australia, and the British had actually made it a penal colony where they used to send their convicts, you know. So after they had discovered this land, they used it for as a kind of a prison to send their convicts there. And the local people, the Aborigines as they are now called, were invaded, they were subdued, and they were not given any kind of rights when the British went there. And in fact, it was as late as 1967 that they got their citizenship by a referendum, which is of course a very, I would say very surprising and at a certain level very horrifying picture of how these people went and colonized nations and subdued and subjugated and marginalized the local population there. And you know, as these people started living there, as the European powers started living there and started writing there, they presented this whole picture to be a very rosy one, and this invasion that they had undertaken as a very peaceful kind of a period. But we see when the local natives started writing, when the Aborigines started writing, they presented this period as a very traumatic period. Naturally, they were invaded, they were subjugated, they were marginalized. So from their point of view, it was a very traumatic period, no doubt. And also, after that, you know, the women started writing, then there were new immigrants which went in, they started writing. So there was, you know, a whole lot of body of literature being produced there, and not just British literature. And so there were a lot of diversities in themes, there were a lot of issues that were thrown up. You know, because initially when the British writers wrote, they presented a very rosy picture. Secondly, because of this convict tradition, when they started writing, there was this whole, you know, resistance to authority at that point of time. Then thirdly, there was this whole business of the bush, the outback, the bush, you know, tradition. So that was also being thrown up in the various themes. Then there were women writers who were presenting their own issues. Then there were the fresh immigrants who went there like Judah Wharton. Then there were the diasporic writers like Yasmin Gunaratna who went there. So it was again a very heterogeneous population that made up this Australian culture. Now as far as Patrick White is concerned, when he started writing, the tradition was to write about the outback, to write about the bush, but he was ahead of his times and he wrote about the psychological effects of his characters. You know, in the Solid Mandala, he presents a very, I would say, ahead of his time picture, because the story revolves around two twins, Arthur and Waldo, and together both of them symbolize a mandala, which is like a marble, and it symbolizes complete consciousness. Right. So in that sense, we could say Patrick White wrote far ahead of his times, and while the other people were writing of the convict tradition, the bush tradition, Patrick White wrote about the psychological approach of his characters. All right. It's a very interesting novel, and I sincerely recommend it to all of you to read. Then we come on to the last block, which is block 8, and the novel that we've chosen is The Stone Angel. I have already spoken about why we should study Canadian literature. Just as for Australian literature, it is part of world literatures. It leads to the development of socio-political, historical, cultural relations. It leads to an interaction, and it explores connections between Canada and India. Okay. Now, Canada also, like Australia, was a settler colony. Okay. And the literature of this place also passed through many stages. You know, it began with the European powers setting sail and landing on this vast continent North America, and again it led to a kind of invasion when they subdued the local population. And initially there was a garrison mentality, a very closed-knit kind of community, because these people went, the European powers went, settled there, and sort of made garrisons for themselves in which there was no interaction with the local population. After some time, when they had sort of consolidated their little garrisons, this led to the frontier mentality, in which these people clashed with the local reality. They came into conflict with the what we call now the Red Indians. Of course, now we call them the First Nations people, because they were there first of all. So when they clashed with them, they started conquering their lands and pushing the frontier backwards into the land, inland, right? So after they had sort of consolidated more land, it led to the colonial mentality, because then they were well settled in their area, and they started glorifying and idealizing a past which they sort of brought straight from Europe into this new land. Alright, and in fact, in terms of literature, at that point of time there was a lot of what we call daffodilization. They had no themes of their own. They got something as alien as daffodils. Even here in India, daffodils is not really a flower which we are familiar with. Even in Canada, it wasn't, but it was a European flower. And so, poems by like William Wordsworth, the daffodils, that was sort of imported there, and that became their culture, that became their literature. And it was very late in life that this colonial mentality gave way to a self-defining nation, right? So there were these 4 steps in the history of Canada: the garrison mentality, the frontier mentality, the colonial mentality, till at last it became a self-defining nation. So this in brief was the history of Canada. Now the author that we have chosen for this block is Margaret Laurence, who is a big name in all over the world. She is an author of immense stature, and not only does she write about, she has written I think 7 to 8 novels, out of which 5 are Canada-based novels. They form a series which are called the Manawaka series, and The Stone Angel, the novel, this novel is the first one in the 5 series of novels that she has written in her Canadian phase. Now, she has written of very strong women characters, and the Stone Angel, the protagonist of this novel, is a 90-year-old woman. Perhaps, I think that this is one of the very few novels. At the moment I cannot even think of another novel which has a 90-year-old woman as its protagonist. Now, this woman, Hagar Shipley, is a cantankerous, obstreperous, stubborn old woman who gives endless pain to anyone who comes near her, beginning from her father when she was young, to her husband, to her brothers, to her sons, because she suffers from an intense pride. That is her hamartia, that is her tragic flaw. And eventually, at the age of 90, when she is almost on her deathbed, she realizes that because she has sort of isolated herself from all the people around her, because she cannot give love, she cannot receive love also, and she has sort of put herself in a barbed wire fence, and she has only herself to blame. All right, and that is the time realization comes, and she eventually decides. Of course, it's too late because she is very old and she dies immediately after. But she sort of opens her heart to the various people around her and comes into her own, and to a certain level she kind of achieves an authentic existence for herself. Okay, so this basically was the story. At one level, it is the story of Hagar Shipley, but Margaret Lawrence did not just write these kind of frivolous or superficial tales of her protagonists. At a deeper level, it is the story of Canada as a nation and the various stages in which it has passed. Because just as Hagar is a blind angel, an angel made of stone, similarly, initially Canada too was, it hadn't come into its own. It was under the influence of two very, very strong powers, the United Nations towards the south and Europe across the Atlantic. All right. So it was, being influenced by the mentality of these two nations, and it took them many, many years to become a self-defining nation, and it passed through quite a lot of turbulence and a very turbulent history till it sort of was able to define itself and also realize that the European powers were not the only people who belonged to this nation. The First Nations people, the indigenous population too had a voice. The native Canadian had a voice, and it was a very, very strong voice which had to be part of the mainstream Canadian literature. And that is why now we have a lot of writing emanating from Canada by the natives, by the First Nations people, and that is being given recognition to a very large extent, just as, and we have to constantly keep tracing parallels, just as the marginalized in India are also finding their own voice. The Dalits here are finding their own voice. They have got a literature which has now entered the mainstream. Okay, so these are the constant parallels that we have to keep tracing in all these new literatures, because they all shared a common history. All right. So these were the 8 blocks that we dealt with. Introduction, African literature, South Asian component, Caribbean, 2 blocks in Caribbean literature, Australian as well as Canadian literature. All right. It's very unfortunate that there have been no questions, there's been no interaction in this session, but I'm sure somebody out there must be listening, and I'm sure you must have gained something from this interaction. And I end this session with these words. Thank you so much. Goodbye and good luck.